Hi, I'm Danny Vance coming at you from the Holler Studio today. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about teacher-student relationships and how that I feel like as teachers we change lives of kids, and that should be something we keep in mind as teachers in our classrooms every day. I want to tell you a little story about a student I had several years ago. I'm going to use his name. I'm going to call him Brian, just for sake of keeping his identity hidden. But Brian came to me one day early in class. I was electronics teacher for 21 years, and Brian came in class one day. It was in August, late August. We were doing safety in our electricity class, and my shop was a really hot room. In other words, my classroom was located inside my shop area, so it was really hot. It was probably 90 plus in there that day, and I'd already started school that year and was covering safety. And the high school sent Brian over on a bus individually after class had already started. They decided to put him in my class because he had been in trouble at the high school. So they sent Brian to my class, and he walked in. I probably rather say he strutted in my class that day. Brian was a big, brawny kid, and he was a tough guy. And so he struts in and he sits down in the back row, rears back and leans back in the chair, and he listens to what I have to say for the first hour. And then the students would take a break. That was a 2-hour block class, so they would take a break and go back to the high school during break. Well, as it turns out later, Brian told me this later, that when he went back to the high school, he went to the counselor and said, and I quote, "If you think I'm going to sit over there and listen to that bald-headed geek and sweat my butt off, you're crazy. I'm not going over there." And the counselor looked at him apparently and said, "Yes, you are going back over there, Brian, or you're going home. That's your choices." So Brian comes back to my class, and needless to say, that first year with Brian, he was a sophomore that year. It was a struggle. He had ways, to cause trouble, little areas, and he was sneaky and so on. But anyway, Brian and I got along pretty good to start with. It was tough, but I noticed Brian was a really smart kid. You could see it initially that he had a lot of potential, but how to get that potential was the struggle. So as the year moved on slowly, we got talking about things with the club activities in our school. At that time, we had a club called VICA. It stood for Vocational Industrial Clubs of America. And they've now since changed that name to Skills USA. But there were several competitions you could enter from our class in the VICA competitions. And, of course, Brian entered into the electronics competition. But there's another one that he was really interested in. It was called the Quiz Bowl. The Quiz Bowl is kind of like a quick recall competition where at that time the questions were based on a third current events, a third general knowledge, and then a third Skills USA or VICA knowledge about rules about VICA. Well, Brian really took to this. Martha Williams was the health science teacher in our building, and she and I worked together with this team for the first year. And we could see that Brian was really excelling in this competition. So we went to the regional level in competition in February, and Brian was almost like a one-man buzzer. He just continually buzzed, boom, boom. There was a team of 4, but he did 90% of it on his own. They won the region, so we took him to the state competition. Again, Brian excelled above all the other students, and like I said, he's almost like a one-man buzzer. But we won the state competition, and that allowed him the opportunity to go to Kansas City and compete in the nationals. At that time, we didn't actually have the funding to send those kids to the nationals the first year, so he didn't get the opportunity to go. So that year ended as the state champions. So the next year, Brian came back to my class. He entered in more in the electronics field. He was more interested there. He didn't really like residential wiring or the motor controls all that well. He's really good at PLCs, programmable logic controllers, but his interest seemed to be in just electronics. So that year, Brian entered the electronics competition and the Quiz Bowl, and he placed third in the state in the electronics, and they won the state again. The Quiz Bowl team from Martin County, second year in a row, won the state competition. So we had the funding that year to send them to nationals. So Brian and his team went to nationals, and they placed third in the nation, which was really good. And like I said, this kid came from a home that was, I would have to say he was probably physically abused as a child. There was drugs related in the family. He was coming from the head of the holler. Yeah, we're speaking from the holler, but he was raised in a holler in the head of Martin County. And not a lot of opportunity, not a lot of hope. But I guess after being with Brian, he was in a 2-hour class, and when you spend a lot of time with these kids, and that's one thing I like about the vocational school, you had the opportunity to spend more time with these kids. Some of the classes were 2 hours, some were 3 hours. So when you spend 2 or 3 hours a day with kids, you get to know them on a personal level. So after seeing Brian excel in these areas, really proud of him. Now, Brian was still, he liked to have fun. He liked to goof off, and he liked to joke and carry on. But when it came down to business, Brian could get it done. He was the man to go to when you wanted it done. Then he came back for a third year. We went back to the state competition in the Quiz Bowl, and they won again, 3 years in a row, Quiz Bowl champions. Sent him off to the Nationals, and I think they got fourth that year. This has been 20, 25 years ago. I don't remember all the details exactly, but I remember Brian. And Brian then decided he wanted to go on to post-secondary in the area of electronics. So we discussed options of schools. We toured several schools, and Brian chose to go to Ashland, to the tech school in Ashland, and pursue the electronics field. So Brian finished his 2 years there, went into the telecommunications industry, and was real successful there. He was actually in New York City the day the towers got hit, and he was across the bay, and he could see the smoke out the window from the hotel he was in. So it was an odd experience for him that day, I'm sure. But Brian then came back eventually and pursued the area of the electronics with X-ray equipment and MRI, and he was very successful. Brian, once he put his mind to do something, he would do it. It was a challenge for him, and he would succeed. And I think that's part of the reason Brian had a lot of trouble as a kid. He was probably bored. He was smarter than a lot of the kids, and he wasn't challenged by teachers. And I think that's what we see a lot of times in classrooms today, where kids aren't challenged enough. So, Brian pursued that career, and right now today, if you get an X-ray or a MRI or a CAT scan anywhere from, say, Huntington, West Virginia, up to Pikeville, Kentucky, Brian probably had something to do with the technology of that equipment, selecting what equipment needed to be installed, installing the equipment, and maintaining the equipment. Brian probably had a hand in that. He's a very smart kid, and a young man. He's made a great career for himself. So really the moral of this story is sometimes we get kids in our classrooms that are kind of thrown in there. Maybe they didn't want him at the high school. He was trouble. And my thinking is, and my philosophy is, all those kids are born with a talent. And as teachers, it's our job to kind of pick at that student a little bit and discover what that talent is, and then figure out a way to progress that student from where they are and keep them interested and keep them on a path that they're interested in, and then pursue a career on down the road and make a successful person out of that kid. Brian had all the opportunity in the world to be a bad student, to be one of those guys who doesn't do anything. But he chose a path. He got on a good path, and he was very successful, and he's still successful today. He's married, got 3 children, and he's living a good life. And I think it's because Brian chose to be different. He chose to pursue a career that he had a passion for, and today he's working in the field, and like I said, he's very successful. So my message is, again, teachers, sometimes go a little further with your students and dig a little deeper and see what their talent is and see what their passion is, and then use your passion as a teacher to push that student into areas that they may not think that they would be interested in, and try to help them get on a path to where they can be successful in life. And if we do that, we've succeeded as teachers. Thank you, and I'll holler at you later.